1 Corinthians chapter 11, and we'll be beginning at verse 2. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions, just as I passed them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God.
Well, good morning to you all. It's lovely to see you here. My name's Orlando. I have the privilege of spending some time in this passage over this next half hour or so. If you found yourself scratching your head a little bit as it was read to us just a moment ago, you can imagine what I've been doing, what this week has been like for me. We are committed as a church to working through parts of the Bible, one after the other, so we cover the whole Bible. We don't miss anything out. I have to say that my commitment has been tested this week to that principle, but no, we are going to stick with it, and hopefully we'll see if the Lord will do something good in us, through us, remaking us our own hearts, and remaking the church as a whole. Why don't we, though, spend some time in prayer just for a moment now? I have to say this has been one of the harder bits of preparation I've had to do for a passage of scripture, and maybe that you found it quite hard to listen to. So why don't we pray and ask for God's help? Our Heavenly Father, you tell us that your word is useful. It's all that we need. It's good for teaching, rebuking, correcting, training in righteousness. And so we ask that by your Spirit, you'd be doing that work in us, in our hearts, and in our church community. Teach us, show us how we can honor you better in our relationships and the way we function together. For the honor of Jesus. Amen. Amen. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the time. That's one sentence in a speech that some of you will recognize straight away. Let me start from the beginning. That goes like this. It is literally impossible to be a woman. Like we have to always be extraordinary, but somehow we're always doing it wrong. You have to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but you have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the time. You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or that you threaten other women because you're supposed to be part of the sisterhood. You have to never get old and never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, you never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard. It's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also that it's all your fault. For those of you who did see the Barbie movie last year, I think it's fair to say that little monologue from Gloria, the character, was the standout moment of the whole thing for many. At the showing that Libby and I went to, there was a spontaneous round of applause at that point. And I suspect that happened actually all over the place. That one little moment of venting about the everyday lived experience of women, the angst, the paradoxes, the tensions, the unfairness, and so on, has clearly struck a chord. I wonder if it struck a chord with you. I wonder if there's anything there that resonates with you. What's extraordinary, though, it seems to me, is the context of that speech resonating for so many. Just think about all that's happened over the last century. It's 100 years since women got the vote in this country and in the USA. And since then, what have we seen? Barrier after barrier has fallen. It's been a century of new freedoms and new equalities for women on every side, as feminism's various waves have broken over society. And yet still, here we are. For so many women, as far as I can tell as a man, it feels even harder to work out life as a woman than it was 100 years ago. Liberation and equality may have brought changes worth celebrating, many of them. But if anything, they've made things more complicated, not less, when it comes to figuring out things like how men and women engage with each other on a daily basis. Turns out that a similar kind of dynamic was in play in Corinth 2,000 years ago. It was the Apostle Paul who brought the gospel to Corinth. He pitched up around AD 50 thereabouts and started talking about the death and resurrection of Jesus and what it meant for ordinary people. It meant that each of them individually could be a whole new person. They could start again with God. And it meant that together they could be a whole new community. All of them, men and women, were equal in their salvation status. You remember how he puts it elsewhere. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there any male or female. For you all are one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3 and verse 28. And all of them, men and women, were able to contribute meaningfully to their church gatherings, which was new. Back in the synagogue, women could attend, but not as members. They had to sit at the back and say nothing. But now in church, it's clear that women in church were full members. In verse 5, in our passage here, you see they're praying and prophesying. They're actually contributing. This is normal. This was a revolution. There's a whole new freedom in this community, a deeper, richer equality status than women had known before. And so far, so good. For all the things that had got a bit messy in Corinth, in verse 2, Paul commends the church for basically staying on message with the steers that he gave them. Verse 2, I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. That's his opening gambit in verse 2. Sorry, not verse 1. If you've got your sheets there, there's a typo there. And yet by the end of this section, it's clear that working this out in practice was not straightforward. So verse 16, if anybody wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. Pretty sharp rebuke, I think, there, to someone who's, well, some of them who are clearly getting it wrong. So what is happening here? Well, apparently what's happening is that, once again, the people have been good at taking hold of their new freedoms, but not so good at working out what to do with those freedoms. I say once again, because we've actually seen this before already, haven't we, in this letter? The watchword in Corinth seems to be, I'm free, I have the right to do anything. And in chapters 8 through to 10, we saw how, thanks to that attitude, things had come unstuck a bit in terms of their place in the city, how they related, where and what they ate. In this next section, chapters 11 to 14, turns out they're bringing that same overemphasis on individual freedom and rights into church. And it's not good. So what is the main thing Paul wants to say as he addresses the men and women of the Corinthian church? His main point, the summary of this whole passage, seems to be this: honor your head. And specifically, honor your head in maintaining God-given gender distinctions. There it is in verse 3. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Now, there are two issues we run into straight away here. One, what does he mean by woman and man? And two, what does he mean by head? So what does he mean by woman and man? All women and all men generally? Or men and women who are married to each other, husbands and wives? It could technically be either. But when Paul uses those words side by side, as in chapter 7, verse 1, for example, he seems to be focused mostly on husbands and wives, those men and women married to each other. So that's most likely what he means in that middle pair there in this verse. He's talking primarily about married men and women, although I'm sure there is some application more widely too. So what about that other issue? What does he mean by head? People disagree about this too, as about almost everything else in this passage. Does he mainly mean the one who must be obeyed, the authority, or the one by whom you must be sustained, the source? Now, the former is actually probably more likely. It certainly seems to be front and center in that other book, that other letter, Ephesians. But actually, in this context, he seems to have a different sense and nuance. He seems to mean the one who must be honored. Honored. Remember, this is the Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about an honor-shame culture in the background here. You have responsibility to bring honor to the one who is over you and responsible for you. And so immediately after commenting about who the head is, in verse 3, you see what he does? Immediately starts talking about the big problem, which is dishonoring that head, verses 4 and 5. Honor is the big issue here, but more even than authority or submission or anything like that. So what is Paul doing? he is setting the whole gender question, the male-female thing, that statement about the head of woman is man, in the context of two other, maybe easier to grasp, head relationships. Do you notice how it sits rather oddly in the middle of that sentence? So he's saying men and women, and in particular married men and women, look how a man is to honor his loving Savior, Jesus Christ, and look how Christ honors his heavenly Father. Well, bring something of that note of honor into your dynamic of married men and women. Honor your head. Now, that is hard to hear today. I know it's hard because of experience that we've had as when we see husbands suppressing or abusing wives, more generally men demeaning women. It's hard because of our culture, because the culture is always wanting to flatten relationships, remove distinctions, make everything symmetrical and equal. It's hard because of associations we make in our minds. Does this mean that if I'm a strong woman, I don't really fit as a proper Christian, or that sort of thing? Or even the words head or honor or authority or submission sound negative to us, don't they? Even dangerous. It's just really hard. Ahead of today, I asked about 100 women in the church for their perspectives. I wanted to try and get a feel for what it is to engage with these kind of themes from a female point of view. And I fed in some of the responses that came back into what I'm saying generally this morning, but not one of those who came back to me seemed to find it easy in any way, this issue. None of them seem to have found a satisfying way of putting it all together. It's just hard. But let's see if Paul can help us in what he has to say in the rest of the passage. If honoring your head in gender distinctions is the message, I think Paul wants to help that message to land in us by going on to say three things. First, let context show you how. Second, let creation show you why. And third, let capacity show you where and when. So first, let context show you how. There's a lot we don't know about how society functioned in Corinth. But it does seem from the statues we've recovered and various writings that have survived and so on, that hair and head coverings played an important part in communicating social signals. So, for example, if you were a woman and you wore your hair down, that was effectively a signal that you were sexually available. If you had your head shaved, that was generally a punishment from society for being sexually immoral and an adulteress or a prostitute. If you wore your head covered with a shawl or something like that, as well as up, that was a strong signal that you were a married woman under the responsibility of another. I suppose equivalent to wearing a wedding band and taking somebody else's surname, I suppose. If you were a man and you had long hair or you covered your head, that was probably because you were a slave or a captive. And so you needed to be marked out and have your place in society made public. Or else you were a pagan priest. They also were marked out by long hair. Now, that was the cultural context in Corinth. To use Paul's own language in verse 14, that was the nature of things. It's just how things are. You can't do anything about it. These are just the cultural conventions of the day. And given that context, it is key, says Paul, that you think about the signals you would be sending to the watching world. Even verse 10, to the angels looking on. I think that's what that strange reference to the angels is, by the way, given chapter 4, verse 9. They just represent the watching world. The point is, think about the signals you would be sending to anyone looking on if you decided to wear your new freedoms in Christ in culturally offensive ways. So, verse 4, men, don't cover your heads when you're contributing to a church gathering. That would bring shame on Christ. You'd effectively be saying something like, I abdicate from my responsibilities, or my Christian freedom is irrelevant to me. Verses 5 and 6. Women, don't uncover your heads when you're contributing at church. That would bring shame to your husband, as much as having it shaved, in fact. You'd be saying, I'm available. Down in verse 13, it's just self-evident that this isn't proper. Judge for yourselves. Verses 14 and 15, it's just being needlessly provocative in your cultural context. Men having long hair, women having short hair. It's not big and it's not clever to ignore the way things are, the nature of things. So don't just get on your high horse about your freedoms, is the message. That attitude of yours, I'm free, I can do what I want. Well, that's true, he says. But if you're wise, you won't flaunt it. You won't make a big thing of it. You'll stick to the normal practice of churches across the region who share these cultural conventions. Verse 16. Don't dishonor your head by blurring the distinctions between men and women in ways that offend in your context. Now, of course, Corinth and that region are not the only context. Other contexts are available, even in the Bible. For example, the context of a Nazarene vow meant that a man should grow his hair long. The context of the temple meant that a high priest should grow his hair long. You see, there are different contexts. And our context is certainly different, isn't it? Nowadays, hats and hair don't really carry with them those connotations of insubordination or availability or anything like that, do they? In fact, it's quite hard to find an easy equivalent for us. Short of maybe my wife Libby over there, she might be come up to pray, and as she does so, she might come wearing a kind of provocative strapless dress. She could take her wedding ring off, announce pointedly that her name is Libby Winter, her maiden name, tell you my 10 most intimate secrets, and then say, "Oh, let's pray." If you were thinking about doing something like that, maybe don't. But you can see it's not easy to find an obvious equivalent in our context. The most natural application might just be really in the way that married people speak to their spouse or speak about their spouse in public. It's probably where dishonor is most likely to show itself. In fact, you married people, there's a few of you here today, it's probably not a bad question to ask your husband at some stage. Are there ways that you feel I embarrass you or undermine you when we're in the presence of other people in the church or wherever? And make it easy for him to answer and be honest. Maybe have that conversation once in a while. So there it is. Honor your head. Let context show you how. But what's the rationale for all this? Why is it actually important to maintain the dynamic between men and women? Well, here's the second thing that Paul wants to address. Honor your head, let creation show you why. Actually, this might be really helpful for us just at this point because, well, we've just seen that the way you express the headship dynamic between men and women depends on your cultural context. And so the temptation might be to think, well, maybe the whole principle is in that basket. Is it all just cultural? I mean, the whole idea of headship sounds so weird to our culture. Maybe God doesn't intend for it to have any place in our lives in 21st century Southampton. But it's almost as though Paul can read our minds, because it turns out he is determined to show that the principle of headship actually transcends culture. Verse 7. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, because of the angels. I don't know what your time machine of choice might be. For me and my generation, does anyone answer? It is, of course, the DeLorean of Back to the Future. Maybe for you it's the TARDIS of Doctor Who, or maybe it's the Time Turner from Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. One of those, I'm sure, may have some resonance. Whatever it is, though, Paul asks you to lay hold of it right now, get in, or whatever you do with it, and go back to creation itself. Genesis chapter 2. See, what was the running order of creation? Do you remember? Well, let me remind you, he says. It was man first, created directly by God from the dust of the earth and his own breath, and then put to work by him. He was a glorious tribute to his creator in that sense. And then it was woman, created from the man. She was, remember the phrase, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, he says. And it was she who made it possible for the man to do his work. She was created for him in that sense, and she became a glorious presence to him in his life. Now, there's nothing about superiority here or different status. It's just how it happened, how God did it. But what it means for us is that there's now a blueprint for relationships between men and women that does apply to all cultures and times, everywhere. There's a difference and an order to be maintained. Suppose you built a house. Anybody built a house here? I built a bit of the house, I suppose. Suppose you built a house. Once the foundation is in, well, what do? You have to build the walls first, don't you? Usually goes better that way. But the house isn't complete until you've also built the roof. That is the order of building. You work upwards. Now, when it's done, it looks great. The walls not cracking or crumbling are a tribute to the solidity of the foundations on which they sit. And the roof kind of sets off the walls in a wonderful way. Often aesthetically, it's very pleasing. But more importantly, functionally. Only when the roof is on will the house actually keep the water out and make the place habitable. But the result of the design is that the walls and the roof actually face in different directions. And the materials used are good for those different directions. Bricks, okay for water, great for weight bearing. Tiles, not so good for weight bearing, but excellent for water. They're equally crucial to the house. And of course, ultimately, the foundation supports all of them. But they face different ways. So they have a slightly different design and function. They're not symmetrical. And our challenge, I suppose, when we think about men and women, is to hold on to both of those things. The equality and the difference, the asymmetry. When the culture all around us says you can't do that. Our culture says, doesn't it? If there's not perfect symmetry, they're not equal. God says, rubbish. It's just not true. So let me ask you, do you believe God on this? Do you actually believe him? And if you do, does it affect the way you think and act more than the messaging of the world around us? But there is a caveat here. Let context show you how. Yes, let creation show you why. But third, let capacity show you where and when. It would be very easy when thinking about gender distinctions to obsess about how men and women are different from each other. They are, of course, different in some fairly obvious ways and some less obvious ways. The neurobiologists love this stuff, don't they? They get very excited about the differences. Brain sex, men are from Mars, women are from Venus, all that kind of thing. There's definitely something there. And if you're preparing for marriage, or you want to do your marriage better, then you'd be wise to think about those differences, maybe a little bit more than you do. But that's not really where Paul wants to leave things here. He wants us to leave us thinking about capacity and complementarity. That is not how we might embody a difference from each other, but where we might use the difference for each other. Let me say that again. He wants us to think not so much how we might embody a difference from each other, but how we might use the difference for each other. Because the reality is, we need each other. Verse 11. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. Men and women need each other. They need each other in marriage and family, in the church, in society. We need each other. We'd be lost without each other. I mean, just think about it, says Paul. Verse 12. Yes, it is true that the first woman came into the world from the first man, but ever since, for every creation of every other human being since, it's been the other way around, hasn't it? For as woman came from man, so also man is, nowadays, current practice, born of woman. But everything comes from God. An appropriate thought, perhaps, for Mothering Sunday to take note of and to celebrate. As a man, I do not have the capacity for childbirth, so naturally I'm going to defer to my wife. It's a fairly obvious thing. There's actually lots of areas where my capacity is limited, and therefore I might choose to defer in that sort of way. I brought along a couple of things I found in my kitchen. Here is my cooking apron here. There it is. Let's put it on. And that's true. That needs to be taken care of, taken notice of in more ways than one. I also brought along Libby's cooking apron here, which is slightly different. Makes a point. There it is. I've learned over many years that given our relative capacities, it is generally best to take that apron seriously, for her not to defer to me in this area, but the other way around. I would love to find a slightly less stereotypical area to illustrate the point, but you get the point anyway, I'm sure. It's another obvious area where I know my capacity and I actually need to defer. But again, it's true in all sorts of areas, not just in the home, but in church. I mean, look, what am I doing here? I'm doing this job at the moment, aren't I? I'm preaching. I'm opening up God's word to the congregation. But the truth is, without the ongoing ministry of the women in this church in 1,000 different ways, Christchurch would just collapse overnight. Nothing left. We'd just be nowhere. We have different gifts, time, energy, opportunities, capacities generally, which means it would not be wise to be too wooden in our application of the headship principle. Because we do need each other. We're not self-sufficient. Let capacity show you where and when. Well, look, it's time to wrap things up, but just a few reflections as I do. I'm going to give you three. First, learn from the master. Learn from the master. Men, this is for you. Let me ask you, how will you exercise your headship? And in fact, how will you more generally interact with women? We don't get to abdicate our responsibility, which will be the temptation for a number. That is not open to us. Paul uses the word disgrace to summarize the attitude of how some men actually lay aside their role, their place. But neither do we get to abuse that role. We want the women around us to flourish. We want them to be blessed through knowing us, through our interactions with them. You're not demeaned or put down. I wonder if I might just say this, because it does need saying every now and then. If you, man, if you are so low on self-awareness or so high on worldly influence, or both, that you use your strength of body or of mind or of wit or of emotion or of social standing or whatever it is to put down the women around you, to have a laugh at their expense, to in any way demean the women around you, you will be confronted about that behavior here at Christ Church. You'll be confronted by your friends, by others in your small group, if you're in a small group, if necessary, by the elders of the church. Because we simply will not have that kind of behavior in this church family. We won't. Make Jesus your study. That would be my encouragement to you. What does Jesus do with his privilege and authority? John 13, you may remember that's a famous chapter where Jesus, we're told, verse 3, knew that the Father had put all things under his power. So verse 4, what does he do? He got up for the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to what? Wash his disciples' feet. And having done so, he says, verse 14, now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. See, privilege and authority are stewardship responsibilities. And the way you steward them is to use them to serve others, not yourself. Learn from the master. Second, concluding reflection, grease the wheels. This one is for you women, if I may. A headship honor dynamic in relationships, in the home or in church or wherever it is actually quite a tricky thing to maintain. It kind of clunks and squeaks and jams very easily. In fact, it just feels really odd for both men and women, doesn't it? But here's the thing. You women are often much better than us men at reading the room at sensing the dynamic that's at play here, at spotting ways to make interactions just a bit healthier. And I want to say, do you know what? Go for it. Grease the wheels in that way. Do your bit to encourage the culture of those relationships. I was listening to a woman this week reflect on how the way that she used to co-lead her mixed student Bible study group. And she said that when she led the study, one of the things she always used to do at the end was to ask her male co-leader to close in prayer. Now, she felt that was just a helpful way of affirming his leadership role, of honouring him, deferring to him, to sum things up in that way. Now, she didn't need to do that. There's no rules about that kind of thing. But she just felt, from her observation, from her intuition, she just decided that it would be helpful for the dynamic of that group to do things in that way. Do you see? Yeah. Often a woman in a marriage finds that she actually has to gently and perhaps not too obviously encourage her husband to take a lead and exercise headship in some way, in that context. I'd commend that to you. Go for it. In fact, I think Paul himself would commend that. One of the many head-scratching verses in this passage, for me, is verse 10. Why does Paul say a woman have authority over her own head? When he could have said something like, a woman should wear a sign of the man's authority on her head, or something like that. I'm still not sure, by the way. But I wonder if what Paul is saying is it's on her to make the call about deferring to the man and the way that she does that. She's free. How will she use that freedom? Grease the wheels. And third, just briefly, all of us, at the most basic level of all, how about we learn? How about we commit to, in fact, celebrating the differences between men and women, rather than doing what the world around us tells us to do, which is to minimize them. God knows what he's doing. Well, let's close there and let's have a moment of quiet, and I'll lead us in prayer. Oh, Heavenly Father, this has been a hard passage to look at, hard to understand, but also hard to accept and to put into practice. And we ought to confess the ways in which we have, perhaps in our own minds, our own hearts, our own lives, found ourselves simply imitating the world around us in our relationships together, on our interactions together. And where that's true, Father, please would you help us to discern how we can restore a healthier dynamic, a healthier way of interacting together in our marriages and in our church family. Might this church family, Christ Church Southampton, be one which truly does display the glory of our head, the Lord Jesus, as we interact with each other. Amen.